for this introduction. I am so pleased to be here. I'm a longtime follower and fan of the Khaki Lab. So when I was asked to come and give a talk and workshop, I was so flattered. And seriously, to all of you who are here on a Saturday evening, I know I have serious Zoom fatigue, so to be attending an online lecture is serious commitment. I'm really flattered and touched by your presence. So thank you for sharing your time with me. Let me share my screen. So I will be talking about culinary culture. And then we want to go full screen. I think that is going to work. And I've included my Twitter handle. You can also reach me at my email, which is just my name. So lily.kelting@gmail.com. Because a lot of the, points that I'll be making today are really more openers than closers, right? So if you feel called or interested to continue the conversation tomorrow at the workshop or beyond, I really invite that. So you're here, many of you are here, I imagine, because you're interested in heritage, right? You're on the Khaki listserv, and me too, right? We want to keep India's heritage alive and kicking. What an important need, right, to celebrate heritage. But often I find that it's much easier to think about tangible heritage than intangible heritage, right? It's much easier to point to monuments and art and architecture and say, like, we need to save this, versus intangible practices, and especially something like food, for reasons that I'll get into. So my number one kind of point today in this talk is to just make a kind of an argument for culinary heritage as part of heritage, to bring food into this conversation. And it's really, an important piece of the puzzle, I would say, when it comes to cultural preservation, even if it's not the most visible or obvious thing. I also want to clarify that this is not going to be any specific historical or cultural information about any one culinary heritage, right? So there are amazing experts in, Konkani cuisine, Kodava cuisine, every region and sub-region and community, I think, has some really knowledgeable experts who have devoted enormous time and expertise to documenting those practices. That is not what I'm going to do here today. That's not really my job as I see it. So what I'll be doing instead, rather than this deep dive into any one heritage, is to actually kind of try to provide a survey of the concept of culinary heritage itself. So if we take all of those experts and think about the way that they're talking about rice, or they're talking about a specific dish, what's common to the way that they're talking? Like, what concepts are they using and engaging? And how can we map those? So maybe this is a bit more academic, a bit more theoretical than some of the other Khaki Lab talks. For that, I just say, I hope it's engaging. Stick with me. Put your questions in the chat. Really happy to kind of work in dialogue with you all here. But again, just kind of focusing on the rhetoric and the concept of culinary heritage. What's the use of this concept? That's my kids. What's the use of this concept in India? So the second point that I want to make is that last part, right? What's the use of this concept in India today? Because I'll introduce, thank you, Suki, for the introduction. I'll introduce some concepts of culinary heritage, like how have other people used this concept? And they're really European. They all come from Europe, and they're really Eurocentric as a result. And while you can apply some of these concepts to India, it doesn't really fit. So I'll show in the second half of the talk how it doesn't really fit. And that's then kind of the argument for new frameworks for culinary heritage. I think we're going to need India-specific, or maybe Global South-specific frameworks for culinary heritage in order to protect it and celebrate it and legislate around it, because I think that a lot of these existing frameworks don't work well enough, to kind of do what they need to do in India. So that's my second main point of the talk. In addition to, like, for the heritage people, please don't leave the food people out. Not that you're doing that, but you know, anyway, you've obviously included me. But you know, culinary heritage is my first main point, and the second main point is culinary heritage really needs to think about India. You know, really needs to think specifically about what other non-European cultures can add to the concept. And for those of us, you know, you close with this question, like, who's going to protect culinary heritage? Everybody. Spoiler alert, it's you. You know, it's me, it's all of us. So that's tomorrow's situation. But yeah, I think this is something that really is going to require a mass movement. And so what does that look like? I think as we're kind of thinking conceptually about culinary heritage, we can also think about how to really shape the future of preserving Indian traditions together. Okay, so the broadest possible philosophical background. Wow. Why aren't we talking about culinary heritage? Why is culinary heritage not central to the heritage conversation? And the answer, I think, is pretty easy, complicated, which is that it relies on taste. And taste is really subjective. It's really hard to talk about taste. So even if you, it's mango season, right? So even if you have somebody, for example, you have somebody who has a lot of experience eating mangoes. Many of us, maybe. And let's say there's somebody who has had both hapus mangoes and kesar mangoes a number of times. So they know that there's a difference between hapus mangoes and kesar mangoes. And that same person has experience thinking really critically about the sensory process of tasting, okay, which is, again, not everybody, right? Like, not everybody has a palate, right? Like, used to kind of eating slowly and thinking about those tastes as they're experiencing them. Very few people, I think, actually have that kind of awareness. So even if you have somebody who knows mangoes really well, has like knowledge and experience, and has a strong palate and ability to talk about food, and you ask that person to describe the difference between kesar and hapus mangoes, like, most of what I read is really basic, right? It's like, one is orangier, one is sweeter, one is a little richer, the other's a little milder. And these are really broad categories, but we don't have a really good language for talking about taste. So then think, maybe this person is going to write an application to UNESCO to put hapus mangoes on the World Heritage list. Like, how are they going to describe what's distinctive and unique and typical for a hapus mango? It's really difficult, right? I mean, even for those of us who say, like, yes, you know, I'm a food person and I'm a culinary industry professional, it's really difficult to talk in specific detailed terms about what things taste like. And that makes it really difficult on a material level to protect culinary heritage. The other thing, and this is, again, like a really broad baseline point that I want to share, is that taste is suspect. So we live in a post-Enlightenment world, right? In I should have looked this up. I'm going to say 1638. We can fact check it at the end. Rene Descartes says, "I think, therefore I am," right? So we're in this post-Enlightenment world where our mind is good, objectivism is good, rationalism is good, body is kind of suspect. Maybe it hinders our true purpose, which is thinking critically. And that shows up in a lot of the conversations around heritage, right? What is our patrimony? What are the things that we're proud of as a humankind? It's often not things that have to do with our bodies, right? There's a very strong mind-body problem, and this is just a fun cartoon. There's a really strong mind-body problem, intellectual inheritance that we have, which is that the mind is seen as good and the body is seen as bad, and that's pretty cross-cultural, I'm sorry to say. So, you know, it also makes reframing food as cultural heritage much more difficult for that reason. And I'm going to get political, which I hope is, you know, I don't lose any of you here. It also, I think, really deeply impacts how we value who we value, right? Who is associated mostly with bodies, with labor? Who is associated mostly with mind and knowledge, right? Like, I think this is part of the reason that cooking has been historically so overlooked, is because it's performed by women, and that agricultural labor is also really caste specific, right? So, you know, I think if we're going to really take on this concept of culinary heritage, we have to deal with the fact that part of the reason that culinary heritage is marginalized or overlooked is because of these really deeply held philosophical biases against people seen as more in their bodies and less in their minds. Whew, we did it. We're done with the epistemology slide. We can move on. Okay. What is culinary heritage? Maybe some of you are like, I don't know, I signed up for this talk and I don't really know, like this was a random thing I decided to do. So let me define it. Good academic practice. I'm going to read, this is from an article from the Journal of Heritage Tourism. So ethnic pride, national patriotism, familiar and regional patrimony, agricultural traditions, and many other markers of identity are safeguarded in part at least, by the preservation of gastronomical traditions. So it's like if we put the Alfonso mango on the UNESCO World Heritage list, we're not just saving mangoes, we're also saving, right, an entire social and cultural sphere that orbits around mangoes. And from a heritage perspective, this is for the heritage people in the room, cuisines are a mix of tangible ingredients, cooking implements, and intangible taste, smells, recipes, and eating traditions elements that contribute to the cultural values and characteristics of places. So basically, it's very complicated because there's a material, real thing, which has to do with food. There's an immaterial thing, which has to do with practices, and they all kind of come together to understand culture, values, and the sense of place. Which is another reason maybe why, less has been kind of done or written about protecting culinary heritage. But who is working to safeguard it? So here's where I'll give my 3 examples of representative, let's say, concepts and institutions that are like how we talk about culinary heritage. The first is slow food. So I'm going to start with the specific, and then I'm going to go really broad, and then I'm going to end up more specific. So it's like a diamond shape today. So I wanted to share this example because it's probably the best known institutional protector of culinary heritage, right? So slow food, it's an NGO, it's a trademark, it's like a real thing, right? There's a board, you can buy a membership. And I think that's significant, right? Because slow food is like, because it's something so tangible, we can talk about it more tangibly. So here's what they're trying to do. They have 2 main programs. The first is called the Arc of Taste, and the second are Convivia and Communities. So Slow Food was founded in 1989 by this fellow, Carlos Petrini. And allegedly, I don't know if the story is true, but what I heard or what I read is that he was walking through Rome with his friends and saw the first McDonald's that had opened in Rome. And it's like right by the Spanish Steps. You have this kind of like really important material built environment heritage of Italy. And he saw the McDonald's there and he was like, no, we need to protect Italian culinary heritage, right? Like globalization is going to take over our traditional foods. And he started Slow Food. And this, of course, ties into much broader conversations that we can have about the local versus the global. Some of you may be familiar with the story of Jose Bové. I think that's how you say his name, in France, who's an anti-globalization activist who took McDonald's as his kind of emblem of, everything that was bad about encroachment. But back to the platform. So how do they do this? They have 2 kind of main programs in protecting culinary heritage. One is this Arc of Taste, which is like a list of specific, region-specific foods that they would kind of put on the Noah's Ark of food if there were, ever a situation in which only a few foods would need to be kind of preserved and protected. These are like the special list. There's only one from India, by the way, which is oranges from Meghalaya. I have never even heard of, honestly, until I did that research. So if anyone has had Meghalayan oranges, please let me know how they taste. I think that little factoid reflects a much larger systematic question around slow food, which is how global is it? So the second thing is that slow food has these communities of convivia. So these are locally rooted groups of people who sign up to be a slow food community or convivium, and they do events and activities. So a lot of these have to do with like tasting awareness, trying to get people to develop their palate. So they do kind of tastings, guided tastings of certain foods. and they do chef events and other kind of pop-ups. But something that I and others have noticed is that it tends to be kind of top down. So whoever is the head of this local convivium will really kind of set the tone, and then people kind of participate, but it's not like a horizontal organization structure in that sense. It's that these chairs of the convivia decide kind of what is going to be done. So as you can kind of tell, slow food has had a lot of critiques, and I'm actually really not, like, I have no dog in this fight at all. I'm definitely not here to be like, slow food sucks. I don't think it does. I think it's a really, really powerful, important global organization. But I want to voice some of the critiques of slow food because, as I say, this conversation is happening in India right now. And so I think if we can learn from slow food what some of the problems with slow food have been, we could build a better Indian food movement. That's my contention. So the most kind of like punchy critique of the slow food movement comes from a 2004 article by the French, or not French, oh my God, British food historian and food studies scholar, Rachel Loudon. And I really recommend her work to you all. I think she's just like an incredibly knowledgeable and sharp thinker and researcher. So she wrote a review of the slow food book, which came out in the early 2000s. And it's a skewering review. And in the skewering review, she says the poor are stuck with the tyranny of the local. So, you know, we're trying to protect culinary heritage. Like, who is this for? Is this for consumers so that we can enjoy tasty foods? Or is this for producers so that they can continue their heritage livelihoods? So again, you know, if you'll allow me to maybe digress or give an example, I'm researching right now this so-called millet movement in India. If such a thing exists, I don't know, but there's a book about it. People say it is happening. So I'm trying to figure out what it is and what's going on. So, you know, I think this millet movement is a really great example of some of the critiques of slow food, or how the slow food model is much more complicated in an Indian context. Those of you who are zooming in from Fort, I'm going to give a Fort area example, which is at the Kaligota Cafe. You can get a ragi chocolate pudding, and it is delicious. I order it every time I'm even in the vicinity. Raise your hand if you've had it. Can I look at the first? If you've had this very dish, raise your hand. Maybe there's some other ragi chocolate pudding fans in the house. Yeah, it's great. It also costs 60 rupees, which is kind of a lot. Uh-oh. That's not what I meant to do. It's kind of a lot of money, right? And at the same time, of course, another part of the millet movement are like Dalit and Adivasi farmers doing seed saving and, you know, growing and eating millet in the face of extreme climate challenges, rendering normal agricultural production difficult or impossible. So millet becomes a sustainable solution for them, not because of its heritage, but because of its basically economic viability and drought resistance. So, you know, how could we account for both of those things is what I'm trying to say. And I'm not sure that the slow food framework is exactly working here, right? Like, we can enjoy eating our local indigenous grains in an urban environment, but is that really contributing to poor rural farmers' livelihoods and social protections? I'm not so sure. This is really more of a question than an answer. I'm not trying to, you know, provide solutions. I'm mostly trying to just frame what some of the key questions are. So I hope that we can kind of share these questions together. I definitely don't think that I know the answer. So, okay, now we go to Parmesan. So if slow food is a specific non-governmental global organization, protected designation of origin is a slightly broader category. So it's a governmental category that's actually authorized by the World Trade Organization, and then in a European context, it's legislated by the European Commission. You don't need to know all of that. Let's talk about Parmesan. Parmesan is the most kind of well-known, one of the strongest examples of protected designation of origin products. So to be called Parmesan, a cheese has to come from a really small, basically it's 2 counties in Italy with like a little two little other loops and two other, so technically four, but really just two counties in northern Italy. And not only that, but the milk has to come also from that same pretty small geographical region. And not only that, but the cows have to be fed on hay and grass only. So it's really, really tightly protected, right? What you can and can't call Parmesan cheese. And that's important because there are a lot of kind of like sneaky loopholes, right? In olive oil is the other example that I've read some about. You know, you'll have geographical indication olive oil, but it will be made in a certain region of Italy, but the olives will be grown in Spain and shipped in. And so like technically it's Italian olive oil and they can put some kind of a stamp on it, or they can say it's Italian, but the olives themselves actually are not Italian. This is like apparently a very common scam. I visited some olive oil farms, olive farms in Spain, and they were like very heated about this. They had strong opinions about Spanish versus Italian olive oil and who's getting the credit and who's doing the work. So you may have heard that you should buy Parmesan cheese that says Parmigiano Reggiano on the label, like this one over here on the left, right? You may have heard that that's like the only good authentic Parmesan. And that's because of the strength of the Parmigiano Reggiano consortium. So the consortium is the one that manages the protected designation of origin label. So every year, if you're a cheese maker in Italy, the consortium guy, Parmesan maker in the Parmesan region, a consortium guy kind of comes around and taps on the cheese with a like kind of a device and listens to the cheese, and then you get the stamp. They've been doing that since the 60s. So, you know, it's basically a trade union that's trying to protect their intellectual property, right? So I should also say that cheese is really big business, right? So if slow food has these kind of like idealistic goals and values and idealistic problems, protected designation of origin is really primarily a legal and economic framework. So this is about like people suing people and people protecting money. So the figures that I've read is that a PDO, protected designation of origin product, is has 200% the sales value, or up to 250 in Scotland, apparently. Like if it's protected designation of origin smoked salmon, it has 250% the sales value of generic smoked salmon. So this is big business. So it's not only, again, about like protecting our culinary heritage in an idealistic sense, like for the greater good of human patrimony. It's also really about money. And you see that in Parmesan cheese so clearly with the lawsuits against Kraft. So in a European context, Parmesan is like the big dogs, but obviously globally, just like with slow food, there's a much bigger, you know, enemy. There's like a bugbear, and that bugbear is multinational corporations. So in 2008, the consortium, the Parmesan Cheese Consortium, won a huge lawsuit that you can't use the word Parmesan in Europe to describe any cheese except for protected designation of origin Parmesan. So that's a huge deal. And then they've also been able to kind of legislate so that Kraft is unable to enter other global markets using the term Parmesan and King of Cheese. I'm not exactly sure how, because the protection of Parmesan is only in Europe, but they've successfully won suits in Ecuador and in New Zealand to prevent Kraft from selling Parmesan cheese in those regions. So again, this is like major international economics. This is like about markets and yeah, like legislation, governmental policy. There's really a lot at stake when it comes to these PDO designations. This may be changing though. You know, it's interesting. So the Parmesan Consortium has been really successful, but I do wonder how long this kind of legal protection for heritage products is going to last. Very recently, like this year, an American court basically untrademarked the phrase Gruyere. So Gruyere is also a protected designation of origin product. Like you can't, in Europe, you can't call something Gruyere unless it's from around Gruyere in Switzerland. Like it's in French, it's AOC, you may know. But basically it's a protected product. And the American federal court basically said, like, doesn't matter, you can use the word Gruyere in America to mean anything. We're not going to recognize it because there's a lot of really good Gruyere producers in America, and so we're not going to recognize the AOC framework. So they, the European Gruyere Consortium lost the suit, and I wonder about the implications of that, right? Like, will that signal the weakening of these PDO consortia? Maybe they'll change. I'm like a small utopian part of me is like, maybe there'll be other ways that these heritage foods are protected from multinational takeover, or maybe it's really urgent and already kind of big business industrialized cheese is like already knocking at the door of Parmesan. Last of the three is terroir. So terroir is really hard to define. Even I was talking recently to a winemaker, and she was talking about her experience talking to other winemakers about terroir. And she's like, oh, I mean, do microbes count as terroir? Does the winemaker matter or not? Like, these are hot topics. So it's not like, I'm sharing with you any dictionary definition of terroir. I think it's a concept that's very debatable. So that's important, right? Because Slow Food is an organization with specific bylaws and practices. PDO is a legal and governmental framework that, again, has, specifics attached to it. But terroir is really just a concept. But what I want to say today with you is that it's not a neutral concept, right? It's a concept that gets mobilized for particular political reasons by particular people. So that, to me, as a cultural person, is like what's interesting, most interesting. But what is terroir? Like, a very loose definition would be it has to do with the climate, like temperature, sun, wind. Like, is there salt breeze coming from the ocean? That would be part of terroir. The terrain, what's the elevation? What's the grade of the slope? Which way do the slopes face? Soil quality and soil composition. And then lastly, again, this is a little more debatable, tradition, like the technique by which something is made, or even people talk about the tradition in a specific winemaking family, or even a specific like hands of the winemaker. The term's mostly associated with wine, to a lesser extent cheese, but I think now, it's a much broader conversation, around other types of food as well, and the terroir that they may have, the taste of place that they may have. So terroir is kind of a really broad category for how place impacts taste. So Rachel Laudan, again, my favorite writer on this, calls a terroir modern yearnings for a romanticized past. And I think, we can wonder about that. So I want to highlight two different times that terroir as a concept gets kind of lifted up. Like, when are people talking most about terroir? And the first has to do with the great French wine blight of the 1860s. Do people know about the great French wine blight of the 1860s? You can raise your hand and I'll know how much detail to go into here. But basically, in the 1860s, a small little aphid started attacking all of the French vines, and the industry was in big trouble, and it looked like there might be kind of no more wine, and they tried everything. These kind of wine trade unions put out huge prizes if anybody could invent a pesticide that would kill these little aphids. None of the pesticides really worked, and some Americans in Texas, of all places, noticed that this is actually a kind of aphid that they had encountered in America. And they had this idea that they could bring American rootstock, like the roots of the vines, bring them to France, graft them on, and that the plant that would grow out of that graft would be resistant to the aphids. And it worked. So they called this my French. I can't speak French, you guys. I'm sorry, but the reconstitution. So since basically like the 1900 turn of the century to today is like they call it the reconstitution, And it's taken a long time for French wine to come back. So, of course, this caused like a deep existential question in the French wine industry. Like, are our vines really ours? Are they American? Is this American wine because it's grown on American roots? You know, it's a spooky thing for them. So it's no surprise that it's exactly at this time that the protected designation of origin process begins in France. The AOC process begins at the same exact time because they start to say, well, French wine depends on terroir. You can't grow Cabernet in Texas, right? It has to do with our soil. It has to do with our climate. It has to do with our elevation and our slopes. Like, you can't recreate this anywhere else because terroir is really important. But they're not saying that in some vacuum. They're saying that in direct response to a real threat, you know, a threat of internationalization. The other example I want to share is from my own research. So you won't see this on Wikipedia or whatever. This isn't like a fact. This is my research, my publishing, I guess. You could read about it on JSTOR or whatever, in Food, Culture, and Society. But I'm interested in the way in which terroir gets mobilized in the US South. So this is my PhD dissertation research. And what I found is that people start to talk about terroir, meaning like ecology, the taste of place in the South. And it's a way, I really think, of talking about Southern landscape without talking about the factors that have shaped Southern agricultural history, which are, of course, slavery, right? Sharecrop farming, like everything that's happening in the American post-war period. Those social factors are totally evacuated when you just say, like, it's about terroir. This is about the taste of our soil and the taste of our sea breeze. And, you know, it really, really puts the emphasis away from the cultural dimension and onto an ecological dimension. And I argue that's really political, right? It's a way of basically downplaying the contribution of enslaved peoples, and that contribution should be celebrated much more. So terroir is a political concept. Some people say it's nonsense, it doesn't exist. Some people say it's everything. I'm kind of just trying to present you with, like, here's terroir. What do we do with it? So you may be wondering in your mind right now, is there terroir in India? Good question. Last week, I was at an event. I think we're also there, about terroir. And it was also kind of contentious and fun. And the question was asked to the attendees, like, how does terroir work in other parts of the world? And one of the affiliates of the hosting organization was basically like, no, you know, like, Indians don't really talk about terroir. And I thought about that. Okay, Indians don't really talk about terroir using that word, partially because it's really hard to say. Even every time I say terroir, I feel like a French person is gonna come and, like, find me in my house in India, slap me on the head, you know. So maybe people aren't using the word terroir in India, but I think that there's definitely still a concept of terroir. I mean, we all know that, like, Assam tea and Darjeeling tea taste different. Really, you would never get confused about that difference. And that's ultimately a sign that there is such a thing as terroir, that we know that there are tastes of places, and we see them in certain agricultural products like tea. The other kind of thing that I learned while preparing for this talk actually was about jasmine. So I didn't know any of this, but there is an enormous variety of jasmine kind of geographical indication tags, but also like jasmine cultures, for lack of a better word, across South India. And the two most famous, according to what I read, you tell me more if you're all jasmine experts, are Mysore jasmine and Udupi jasmine. And the thing that was interesting is that they're the same jasmine. So it's not like a different cultivar. It's the same type of plant, the same variety of jasmine, but they smell really different enough that they're protected differently by the government of India. And that's because of the climate, the different climates in Mysore and Udupi, right? The soil is different, the sun is different, the elevation is different. so many different ecological factors go into these jasmines smelling really different. So that's another example of Indian terroir. You have these flowers that smell really different depending on where you are, not necessarily how food is produced. So I thought that was really interesting. But of course, terroir doesn't work in the same way in India for a number of reasons, right? It's not Europe. And I think any conversation about terroir in India, which I would welcome and want to be a part of and learn, would need to really account, for the history of the Green Revolution, for one thing, in terms of soil depletion, in terms of agricultural practices, and also in terms of economic liberalization, and the way in which globalization works in India in particular, not in the same way that globalization is impacting Europe. So, I think terroir is a framework that exists in India, but again, like I said at the beginning of the talk, it doesn't really fit or account for all of the complexity that is impacting Indian agriculture and food culture. What about PDO? Are there protected designation of origin products in India? Yes, there are, right? It's called geographical indication. It's based out of an office in Chennai. There's a long list, but the thing that's different in India, and that's why I've given this beautiful background, is 75% of the geographical indication products in India are crafts, arts and crafts. So only 1/4 of these like protected designation of origin style products in India are agricultural products or food. So that's really different, right? Because the terroir framework in Europe, it's 100% food and agriculture. If you look at the PDO list in Europe, it's going to be only, wines, cheeses, some beans, some animal varietals. But in India, you'll see the opposite. You'll see just mostly metal traditions or textile traditions, stuff like that. So because of that, the kind of framing of geographical indication is really different, because it's going to be much less about cultivars or biodiversity or these issues. The way that geographical indication is talked about in India has much more to do with social practices. So it just complicates it. It makes it different. And the two big things in a European context for how to get protected designation of origin status are history and typicity, tipicità in Italian. So typicity means like, is it emblematic of a certain type of thing? And history, of course, is history. And to give an example of this is the amazing, complicated fight for rasgulla. Again, can you raise your hand if this is something that you already know a lot about? I'm obsessed with the rasgulla fights. Yes, okay, like thank you. Yeah, so basically what happened, I'm running so late and I want to leave time for questions, but basically big fight between West Bengal and Odisha over who owns rasgulla, and both history and typicity basically came into the fray, because for history, West Bengal argued that it was a historical dish that was created in 1868 by one specific sweets maker, and the counter letters are quite spicy from Odisha, saying basically, how can you say that this was invented in 1868? Lord Jagannath is timeless. Like this, like in these documents, you can find them online. It's so amazing to me, right? Like, what do you mean by history? The Odisha counter letter is like quoting shlokas, in Sanskrit, basically, to defend the fact that this is a classical bhog item for Lord Jagannath, and so therefore it's an Odishi sweet. What do you do with that on a level, right? In terms of typicity, the ultimate solution that the GI office in Chennai did was to give each of them a different rasgulla, to say, okay, the spongy white rasgulla that have a little squeak, those are Bengali, but there's also a different typical Odishi rasgulla, which is light brown in color and is soft. They're like, if you can eat it without tooth pressure, then it's Odishi. But what's interesting is that a lot of the people who were the claimants in that case weren't really satisfied with that answer, because they were trying to basically say, like, it's not like there's two different rasgullas, it's all the same thing. And by saying basically that our rasgulla aren't typical, don't fit this typicity argument, you're kind of undercutting our cultural heritage when you say that. So it's real, it's about identity, right? Rasgulla are so critical for so many people in terms of their sense of self and community and heritage. And so, you know, it's not just about money. It's not just about legal protections. It's also kind of about like the story that we tell ourselves about who we are. And I think in an Indian context, that is so important to account for. So again, PDO, you know, doesn't really account, I think, for kind of the Indian situation. Okay, I'm going to try to wrap it up. So is there a slow food movement in India? No, like I said, right? There's one Indian product on the Arc of Taste. There's about 6 Indian convivia in the slow food convivia list, but I don't think that they're particularly active. So if there's no kind of institution that's protecting Indian culinary heritage like slow food, you know, then who is? And the answer is a lot of people in a lot of different places in a lot of different ways. And that's what I'm trying to do right now in this research project that's alluded to in the, you know, whatever abstract of this talk is like, who is doing this work, you know, and how can I use my scholarly time and, you know, job to kind of map this and see who's doing what and when. So I want to conclude quite selfishly by saying, if you're working in this space, if this is you, can you email me? I would love to talk to you. Please, you know, because I think it's this vast and largely disconnected network of, like I say, shops, farms, chefs, writers, researchers, journalists, you know, artists, agricultural college faculty, documentarians, homemakers who have a really active Instagram presence. Like, there's so many different people who are preserving India's culinary heritage without that kind of strong institutional backing. And it adheres in so many different ways, right? So when we think about like what it means to preserve India's culinary heritage, it has to do with seeds, it has to do with farms, it has to do with marketing existing foods, like marketing millet so that it's cool and you feel comfortable paying 260 rupees for it, foraging. All of these kind of practices have to go together, I think, to build this Indian food movement. So I saw yesterday that Chef Thomas Zacharias launched a new platform called the Locavore. So I'm really interested and excited to see what that will look like. And my hope, you know, is that it reflects this diversity of practices, this diversity of people and things that need to kind of come together to build an Indian heritage food movement, you know, that's not so striated as the slow food movement between the urban rich and the rural working poor, basically, to be quite simplistic about it. Really, can we build an Indian food movement that doesn't replicate some of the problems of these European frameworks, but really effectively preserves India's culinary heritages in the face of globalization and late capitalism, basically. So that's it from me. I think I don't know, you know, what the future of this research is. I'm still talking to people and trying to map it out. But I think it's bright, you know. Food Forward India is another organization that was working to document and preserve some of these traditions. I think what they realized, based on my conversations anyway, is like it's such a massive effort, and it's actually not really possible for any one institution to do it all. So that's why, again, I'll just plug tomorrow's workshop. I think it's really the kind of an effort that's going to take a lot of single actors coming together under some institutional framework, because it's not something that like one team of 5 people can do. So thank you so much for your time and your attention. I hope that people can stay a little bit, maybe after 7, for questions. I'm so sorry that I went so long.
That's fine. That's fine. Thank you so much. That was so very interesting, because, you know, we've all sort of heard of mentions of Champagne being from, you know, the area of Champagne and, you know, Parmesan and so on. But this casts it, sort of gives it a perspective as to what is the power play that makes this happen. So thank you so much for that. We do have a lot of comments and questions from people, so let me share them with you. I know you mentioned right in the beginning about the oranges from Meghalaya, and of course there is, I think Sanhita has mentioned that Meghalaya oranges, or oranges from Tripura or Northeast, are exquisite. They're sweet tasting, they're aromatic, and also that there's a delicious orange blossom honey from that area, which is from those oranges. And you were talking about millets, and I think millet movement also started in our country because people sort of, moved away from wheat, which was sort of the new wheat, which they had gluten allergies from. So millets sort of got a life of their own, right? There are some amazing authors and uh, chefs who really recreated some of the old millet recipes and so on. So you're right that they're not all sitting in one place; they're all over the place. Sanita also mentioned that olive oil. Again, most of us are familiar that olive oil's a scam. In fact, there's this whole thing that more olive oil gets branded as Italian oil as compared to what is sort of produced in the country. More of it is imported than what is even produced in the country. So, yeah. I had a question for you. When you talked about Parmesan, now, if there is such a high premium, 250%, as you mentioned, wouldn't it, I mean, it makes me move away to not buying that and buying something quite similar, like a Gran Parano or something. Don't they run that risk?
Yeah, of course. And I think that's the big critique of the slow food movement, is that it assumes that a kind of educated urban clientele with an educated palate through these education workshops is going to make the choice solely on aesthetic principles.
Right.
But of course, I mean, for me, like, many of my food decisions are not aesthetic decisions, they're economic decisions. And in terms of access and so many other things, right? Like, how do I choose what I'm going to eat? It's not some obvious calculus where I'm always looking to eat the thing that tastes the best and is the most ethical. Like, sometimes I'm going to eat Maggie because I'm at a train station, or I'm going to eat Maggie because it's late at night and I don't want to cook, or whatever. Like, there's reasons that people make food choices, and those reasons aren't only about the excellence of the product. And I think that's something that is like a real blind spot for a lot of these not food systems, but these like heritage food cultural actors. It's like, yeah, of course people are going to buy Gran Padano. People are going to buy, people are going to buy Kraft. Even worse,
Yeah.
right? Kraft. The other lawsuit, it's like crazy. There's, I wish I had more training in law, but there's also a big lawsuit against the Kraft Parmesan cheese right now, not only for copyright infringement of the term Parmesan, but also because their shredded green canned cheese contains 8 to 10% wood fiber. So like cellulose from trees, which is pretty gross. But it's cheap
Gross.
and people are going to buy it. And I don't want to like build a food heritage movement that thinks that the people who buy Kraft cheese are idiots, because I grew up that way. It's like, I don't think that that's true. But yeah, you're right. By making these heritage products really elite and expensive, people are alienated, and it doesn't account for the fullness of the situation about what people eat and when and why.
Right. So there's a lot of mention of some of the other products, right? Like the tea and the oranges, and a lot of fruits in the country are very sort of terroir, because people say that oranges from just that place, or mangoes from just that place, or lychees. I'm told that when lychee plants are sold outside the state of Bihar, they actually take it with the soil because they firmly believe that it's a soil that will give it the taste that without that it will not be a good lychee plant at all. So but I also wanted to talk about the fact that we did Khaki did a workshop, a series of workshops last year with food heritage or chefs and food authors like Rashina and Sangeeta Khanna, and these are people that we find are really putting together the culinary heritage in the areas, and sort of part of the database that you are collecting will certainly come from people like this, who are really going back to the roots and talking to people, and then assembling the masalas of the country, or the sort of native recipes that they're recreating and so on. So yeah, I think it was really sort of put this entire thing onto a page for us to see. So thank you very much for that. And Since there are no more questions, I think I'll
Yeah. Are
say
there any
bye-bye to
questions?
you and hope to see you again tomorrow. Those are
In
some
case
of the
there's someone
questions
who's
that I
shy.
saw.
Okay. You have any questions, please let me know.
Would
Either
you
in
like
the
to
chat.
would you like to share your email? Because you'd
Yeah.
share your email ID again in the chat so that people can
In
connect
the
with you, because I
chat.
know that a lot of people are interested.
Brilliant. This is my personal email. Yeah, I'm just returning to in-person teaching after 2 years or a little more than 2 years of teaching online. And so I'm really conscious of the fact that people may have questions and they don't want to ask. So I want to just encourage, if anybody feels even remotely interested in the topic, please do ask the questions and I'm happy to kind of answer, because it will help me to think through. Otherwise, yeah, pros and cons. Thank you. Yeah, what are the pros and cons of formalizing the slow food movement in India? I think pros are economic, to the extent that an institution around culinary heritage would provide some economic benefit, the same way that these PDO labels do. That would be huge. I think in terms of cultural diplomacy, India is really missing the boat. Think about the way that the Italian government or Denmark and Sweden have mobilized their culinary heritage as a form of soft diplomacy to get tourists, to become, like a nation branding exercise. I think Indian cuisine is amazing, and the reputation of Indian cuisine internationally is far below what it should be. And so, could an organization help change that? Yeah, I think it could. Cons are everything I said, right? Cons are like that it increases striation, that it's just for rich people in cities, and it doesn't do anything for actual agricultural producers. That it doesn't account for the complexity of these histories. So that would be my con. Thank you so much for that question. Otherwise,
is it a balance between the two?
Yeah, and it's also easier said than done, right? Like, I love my job because I get to just write what I think, but I don't have to be in the, I don't have to be in the Lok Sabha or whatever, debating, what kind of products deserve what kind of tariffs. That's not my job.
True. Are there any more questions?
Okay. Well, I'm really looking forward to maybe seeing some of you tomorrow.
Yeah, that's lovely. Yeah, looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining in today. Thank you, Lily, and see you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.